In this video, I'll help you understand some of the more advanced material in our Chapter 23 folder. We'll start here with the principles of gas exchange, right? We need that membrane thickness to be very, very thin. The thicker, the lower the rate of diffusion, because those particles are going to bump into things. Conversely, the thinner the membrane, the easier it is to breathe. The diffusion coefficient of the gas, which is the sort of like the permeability. Look at this, carbon dioxide is 20 times more diffusible than oxygen for complicated chemical reasons. Surface area is also another very important thing for gaseous exchange. Right here, we're specifically talking about external respiration, right? The gaseous exchange that occurs between the air and the blood. And then the partial pressure. Gas moves from areas of high to low. And so partial pressure can be thought of sort of as the concentration of the gas. And it's, of course, the reason that we give oxygen to our patients who have low O2. Although they might be breathing at a higher rate, that's going to help. If I put a patient on a positive pressure mask, with 5 liters of oxygen, that's really helping to increase the concentration of oxygen and thereby the partial pressure. And so oxygen will flow into their bloodstream more quickly, more easily, and hopefully their O2 sats will start to rise. Let's see here. Oxygen moves from the alveoli into the blood, and most of it binds to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is mostly dissolved in the bloodstream as bicarbonate. And so this is a very helpful video here on slide number 42. You should definitely watch this one to see how everything works. And I'm going to walk you through it right now. When we breathe in, oxygen is pulled down into these bronchioles, and then it goes right through the very permeable alveoli. Likewise, carbon dioxide comes out of the blood and into the breath. And here's how it works. Because there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the alveolus, the lower concentration of oxygen in the blood, oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream. This is passive transport, people. So beautiful. All you have to do is have a pulse and every now and again breathe. And you will make sure that this concentration gradient is maintained. And so the actual transport, the actual gaseous exchange is a totally passive process. This is just good old-fashioned simple diffusion. By the end of this capillary, we achieve equilibrium, at least in young and healthy patients. So when we see O2 sats at 98 and 99, we can be pretty confident that their external respiration is working pretty well. That's the gaseous exchange in the pulmonary circuit. This is external respiration. But if we move down here to the other end, the systemic circuit, remember, powerful left ventricle sending blood through all of these blood vessels into your kidneys and your spleen and all of your skin and all of your bone marrow. It's just astounding. So everywhere else in your body, these so-called systemic capillaries allow for gaseous exchange, but notice the gases are moving in the opposite direction. Oxygen is now leaving the bloodstream and entering the tissue fluid and then into the cell. The cells, which are metabolically active, are generating carbon dioxide. It's sort of bubbling up out of them. And so we have a higher concentration of CO2 in the tissue fluid than we have in the blood. Even though that concentration is not as steep as what we see with oxygen, it's still sufficient to push the CO2 out of the tissue and into the bloodstream. And that has something to do with the fact that carbon dioxide is 20 times more easily diffused through that membrane. So this is, of course, internal respiration, the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissue fluid. Inside of the cells, where the mitochondria are actually using the oxygen and then getting rid of the CO2, that's cellular respiration or aerobic respiration. Just to remind you, it's an excellent activity to watch these videos until you've got it. And then turn off the sound and watch the video again and actually say it out loud like you're trying to narrate the video. It's a really good way of wrapping your mind around these new vocabulary terms and of checking to see if you really understand the concepts. Okay, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is so important, right? Remember, hemoglobin from our blood chapter is this most important protein in the red blood cells. And lots of red blood cells, man, they're so tiny. You actually make a couple million of them every second, and it's just astounding. But every red blood cell contains some 270 million of these hemoglobin molecules. So it's one of the most abundant proteins in our body, and it's the reason that our blood is red. Here's hemoglobin. It is the 4 heme molecules that actually bind to the oxygen. In a chemical reaction that's actually very similar to rusting of a car. Looking out my window right now at my 2001 Toyota Sienna minivan, and she's looking a little rusty, and it's because oxygen is binding to the iron and turning it red. And in just the same way, when we breathe in, oxygen comes into the red blood cell and hooks onto this hemoglobin. Now, the amazing thing about hemoglobin is that the folds, these gentle curves of the globin part of hemoglobin, are actually capable of flexing just a little bit. And so if we look here in the PowerPoint, we see this so-called dissociation curve. What that really means, this is very complicated, and I encourage you to work through it and see if you can understand it from this sort of physics and graphical way. But I'll tell you, it really can be understood in pretty simple English. As the pH changes in the blood, it causes the hemoglobin to let go of the oxygen. As the pH rises in the blood, it causes the hemoglobin to hold on to the oxygen just a bit more tightly. That's really what the Bohr effect is describing. In order to understand this, you got to have pH down. You got to know that low pH is acid. You got to know that it has to do with hydrogen ion concentration. And you need to understand that acid denatures a protein, right? It causes hemoglobin to change its shape. It's the same reason that we marinate meat, by the way. We use acid to break down, to untangle that protein, to make it softer. Here's how it works in the respiratory system. During external respiration,
This is from the air in the alveoli.
During external respiration, the blood gives up a lot of carbon dioxide on this side of the capillary. The amount of carbon dioxide in the blood is directly proportional or inversely proportional to the amount of acid in the bloodstream. Let me open up a little document and type this out. I'm not sure that I did a very good job of spelling it out so clearly in the PowerPoint. But here's what I'm talking about. CO2 in the presence of water becomes carbonic acid. This is H2CO3. Forgive me not subscripting this. Remember that acids by very nature dissociate to give us a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion, HCO3 minus. Oh my goodness, this is the most important chemistry in this whole chapter. Look at this. As carbon dioxide levels rise in the bloodstream, they mix with the water, making the bloodstream more acidic. As CO2, I did it again, CO-at. As CO2 rises, as CO2 levels in the blood rise, pH falls. It becomes more acidic. As CO2 levels fall, what happens to the pH? The pH rises. It becomes more alkaline or more basic, however you prefer to think of it. So look at this. If I hold my breath, what happens to the amount of CO2 in my bloodstream? It starts to go up because my cells are alive and they're sort of burping out all of that CO2 into the bloodstream. As CO2 levels rise, it forms more carbonic acid, and that causes the pH to change, in this case becoming acidic. If I start hyperventilating, I will actually start off-gassing more CO2. I'll start getting rid of more CO2 because, remember, it's 20 times more diffusible. So if I overventilate myself, I actually get rid of too much CO2. It causes the pH to rise. Okay, so here's the connection. We need our hemoglobin to bind to oxygen on this end and carry it. We don't want it to let it go until it gets to this tissue here. And then we want it to let it go, right? It's sort of like the pizza delivery guy who's really possessive. He picks up the pizza and he comes down here and he decides, hey, I don't want to give it to them. Well, that would not be good. And in the same way, hemoglobin, who's holding oxygen too tightly, would just do a full loop and we wouldn't be able to supply the oxygen that we need. So here's the amazing chemistry involved, good people. On this end of the pulmonary circuit, after the CO2 has left the bloodstream, our hemoglobin changes its shape to bind to the oxygen more tightly. It carries the oxygen down to the other end of the systemic circuit, and as carbon dioxide enters the bloodstream, causes the capillary blood to become slightly more acidic, causing the heme to change its shape and to give up its oxygen. Such a delicate balance here, right? We want our hemoglobin to bind to oxygen, but not too tightly. And these tiny changes in pH are enough to denature the protein in a tiny way, forming and breaking new hydrogen bonds. And so you can imagine this just sort of opens up like a flower, just a little bit, and the oxygen comes off. It's really what Bohr effect is talking about. And it's talking about this dissociation curve and oxygen saturation. So under normal circumstances, as long as I'm not on a mountaintop or trapped in a box, I have sufficient PO2 in my lungs. And so I'm going to end up completely saturating, holding 99% of the oxygen that I can. But during exercise, right, our PO2 begins to fall in our tissue, and the amount of carbon dioxide begins to rise, causing an acidic situation. And here we see that the hemoglobin drops to 25% saturation, right? And it begins to deliver the oxygen that we need. Temperature has a lesser effect on it, but it certainly is important, especially when we think about hypothermia. You know, the reason that people could die when their core body temperature drops to a certain point really has to do with this process too. We know that temperature can denature a protein too. So we see in cases of hypothermia, tissues begin to the proteins begin to assume a more solid, rigid shape, and enzymes don't work the same way that they should, and neurotransmitter receptors don't work the way that they should. On the other end of the spectrum, in a case of hyperthermia, look at this, increased temperature, the decreased tendency for oxygen to remain bound to hemoglobin. So as metabolism goes up, more oxygen is released into the tissues, but you could imagine a very extreme case of hyperthermia, heat stroke, or a negative reaction to anesthesia during surgery, where it actually begins to affect their O2 saturation. More of the same. Let's see. This stuff isn't quite as important. Actually, go back to this one really quickly here. Tissue capillaries. As CO2 enters the red blood cells, it reacts with water to form bicarbonate and hydrogen. We knew that already. Look at the next step. chloride ions enter the red blood cell, and the bicarbonates leave, giving us what's called a chloride shift. And so then the hydrogen ions bind to hemoglobin, lowering the concentration of bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, which promotes the conversion of CO2 into bicarbonate. And so that also has a direct effect on this chemistry here. Not surprisingly, chloride is one of the most important electrolytes in our body. And if chloride levels are dramatically off, you could get sick or die. Last couple things we need to talk about: neural regulation of ventilation. This is a reflex arc in our own understanding of involuntary responses and spinal reflex arcs. Remember that it always starts with a chemical receptor, right? There has to be a receptor to detect if something is changed. These are in the central nervous system in the medulla oblongata, and in the peripheral nervous system, specifically embedded within the walls of the carotid arteries and the aortic arch. If I hold my breath, or if I'm choking and my O2 levels begin to fall, or my carbon dioxide levels begin to rise, look what happens. Chemosensitive areas of the medulla and the carotid and aortic bodies are going to detect that change in the pH. It's also true that the carotids and the aortic bodies can respond to falling oxygen levels, something that the central chemoreceptors don't do. The point is, if you hold your breath, you're going to change your blood chemistry, and these receptors are going to notice it. They're not wired to conscious parts of your brain, so you won't get a conscious sensation, but they are wired to these unconscious or subconscious respiratory control centers in the brainstem. Here in the pons, the pontine respiratory group, and down below in the medulla oblongata, the dorsal and ventral respiratory group. Let's start with the pontine for a quick second. The pontine can be affected by higher centers of the brain. So I'm modifying my breathing for speech. If you tell me that I just won $10 million, oh my gosh, right, I would change my breathing. Voluntary control of breathing, like we do when we're swimming or doing yoga or meditating. And then we see that this pons is also affected by emotions. So let me add one little bullet point to this slide right here. The pontine respiratory group modifies breathing from those higher brain centers, including the hypothalamus and the cortex and the thalamus. So here's what you need to know. Modify breathing for exercise, sleep, sex, and emotions. So it is almost universal. Any human on the planet, their breathing will change when they're doing this, or this, or this, or if they're very upset, either for better or for worse. And it is ultimately this pontine respiratory group that sends the signals down to the dorsal respiratory group. Now, follow the path. The dorsal respiratory group goes to the phrenic nerve, which innervates the diaphragm. This phrenic leaves the spinal cord, by the way, at C5, as we had talked about in class. So spinal cord injuries above C5 usually result in immediate respiratory arrest. And unless there's someone there to ventilate the patient, they are at immediate risk of death. If it's below that level, they may go into respiratory distress because of these intercostal nerves being damaged. But as long as their diaphragm is going, they'll still be able to stay alive. See that the ventral respiratory group goes to these other ones, primarily accessory breathing muscles. So what's the most important, the prime generator of respiratory rhythm? It's the dorsal respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group we use when we're taking deeper breaths or when we're forcefully exhaling. And the pontine respiratory group smooths out the edges so we don't have choppy breathing in and out, and modifies breathing for these other situations. So let's think about that reflex. Try to put those two things together. Central chemoreceptors here in the medulla oblongata detect changes in the pH. And the carotids and aorta detect changes, which also sends signals up here. So let's go back to this little flow chart here. As CO2 levels rise, the pH falls. Who detects that? It's detected by the chemoreceptors. The central chemo. How did I never learn to type? That's remarkable. Detected by chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, the aortic arch, and the carotid body. They send a signal to the dorsal respiratory group, which sends a signal to the diaphragm. And so what is the overall effect of an acidic blood? Increase in respiratory rate. And any of you who've been in emergency or urgent care have undoubtedly seen a patient come in with diabetic ketoacidosis, right? They're huffing and puffing like they just came off of a jog, but it's just because the pH of their blood is thrown off. We'll talk more about this later on, but they're so diabetic that they can't use their glucose, so they're making keto acids as a way of trying to fuel their body. It causes acidosis, which causes hyperventilation. What if I am hyperventilating under normal circumstances, not ketoacidosis, but for whatever reason, I'm hyperventilating? Does that change the pH? Yep, because I off-gas more CO2. The more I breathe, the more I off-gas CO2. So pH rises. Is that detected by the chemoreceptors? Of course. Where are the chemoreceptors? Central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic arch. They send a signal to the dorsal respiratory group. And what's the effect? A decrease in respiration, in the respiratory rate. Now, think about that. Why on earth would a decrease in the respiratory rate help to correct this problem? Well, you don't die. You just slow down your breathing. So it allows the buildup of CO2 in the blood and a rising of CO2 in the blood causes the pH to fall until it's back to that level and the chemoreceptors are happy with it. So this feedback loop you can really understand by looking here at these flowcharts and these feedback loops. What's going to happen if my CO2 levels rise? What's going to happen if my CO2 levels fall? And how does that keep me somewhere in the middle? So here's the cool thing. Your respiratory system works even when you don't think about it. Through that reflex, when I'm asleep or if I'm watching a movie and not really thinking about it, or most of the time, frankly, I don't have to think about my breathing. And that's because my respiratory rate is increased and decreased, like fine-tuning an old radio, right? Turn it up, turn it down, and that comes in through those chemoreceptors and out through these brainstem respiratory control centers. Almost done. Looking here back at this slide, we can see there are other effects. Receptors for touch, temperature, and pain. So if you touch something sharp, you reflexively breathe in. Proprioceptors in muscles and joints. So if you're on the soccer field or on the football field, you're not expecting a hit. As soon as someone runs into you, it causes a quick respiratory effect. This one here, the Herring-Brewer reflex. Stretch receptors in the lungs just keep our lungs from overinflating to the point where you can do damage, right? So if you try to hurt yourself by breathing in too much, the Herring-Brewer reflex will prevent you from overinflating the lungs. And then these other ones that we talked about right here, you can see a bit more detail now that the medullary chemoreceptors are sensitive to CO2 and pH. But the peripheral chemoreceptors are sensitive to pH, CO2, and O2. So if for whatever reason my O2 falls, that's going to get picked up right away here. And if my CO2 levels rise, that's going to get picked up in both places. Some good vocabulary for you to understand. Oh my gosh, congratulations. You have reached the end.